Chapter 3, Ship's Duties, Tropics. As we had now a long spell of fine weather without any incident to break the monotony of our lives, there can be no better place to describe the duties, regulations, and customs of an American merchantman, of which ours was a fair specimen. The captain, in the first place, is Lord Paramount. He stands no watch, comes and goes when he pleases, and is accountable to no one, and must be obeyed in everything, without a question, even from his chief officer. He has the power to turn his officers off duty and even to break them and make them do duty as sailors in the forecastle. Where there are no passengers and no supercargo, as in our vessel, he has no companion but his own dignity and no pleasures unless he differs from most of his kind, but the consciousness of possessing supreme power and occasionally the exercise of it. The Prime Minister, the official organ, and the active and superintending officer is the chief mate. He is first lieutenant, boatswain, sailing master, and quartermaster. The captain tells him what he wishes to have done and leaves to him the care of overseeing, of allotting the work, and also the responsibility of its being well done. The mate, as he is always called par excellence, also keeps the logbook, for which he is responsible to the owners and insurers, and has the charge of the stowage, safekeeping, and delivery of the cargo. He is also ex officio the wit of the crew, for the captain does not condescend to joke with the men, and the second mate no one cares for, so that when the mate thinks fit to entertain the people with a coarse joke or a little practical wit, everyone feels bound to laugh. The second mate's is proverbially a dog's birth. He is neither officer nor man. The men do not respect him as an officer, and he is obliged to go aloft to reef and furl the topsails, and to put his hands into the tar and slush with the rest. The crew call him the sailor's waiter, as he has to furnish them with spun yarn, marline, and all other stuffs that they need in their work, and has charge of the boatswain's locker, which includes serving boards, marline spikes, etc., etc. He is expected by the captain to maintain his dignity and to enforce obedience, and still is kept at a great distance from the mate and obliged to work with the crew. He is one to whom little is given and of whom much is required. His wages are usually double those of a common sailor, and he eats and sleeps in the cabin, but he is obliged to be on deck nearly all his time, and eats at the second table, that is, makes a meal out of what the captain and chief mate leave. The steward is the captain's servant, and has charge of the pantry, from which everyone, even the mate himself, is excluded. These distinctions usually find him an enemy in the mate, who does not like to have anyone on board who is not entirely under his control. The crew do not consider him as one of their number, so he is left to the mercy of the captain. The cook is the patron of the crew, and those who are in his favor can get their wet mittens and stockings dried or light their pipes at the galley on the night watch. These two worthies, together with the carpenter and sailmaker, if there be one, stand no watch, but being employed all day are allowed to sleep in at night unless all hands are called. The crew are divided into two divisions, as equally as may be, called the watches. Of these, the chief mate commands the larboard and the second mate the starboard. They divide the time between them, being on and off duty, or as it is called, on deck and below, every other 4 hours. If, for instance, the chief mate with the larboard watch have the first night watch from 8 to 12, at the end of the 4 hours the starboard watch is called, and the second mate takes the deck, while the larboard watch and the first mate go below until 4 in the morning, when they come on deck again and remain until 8, having what is called the morning watch. As they will have been on deck 8 hours out of 12, while those who had the middle watch from 12 to 4 will only have been up 4 hours, they have what is called a forenoon watch below. That is from 8 a.m. till 12. That is from 8 a.m. till 12. In a man of war and in some merchantmen, this alternation of watches is kept up throughout the 24 hours. But our ship, like most merchantmen, had all hands from 12 o'clock till dark, except in bad weather, when we had watch and watch. An explanation of the dog watches may perhaps be of use to one who has never been at sea. They are to shift the watches each night so that the same watch need not be on deck at the same hours. In order to effect this, the watch from 4 to 8 p.m. is divided into two half, or dog watches, one from 4 to 6 and the other from 6 to 8. By this means they divide the 24 hours into 7 watches instead of 6, and thus shift the hours every night. As the dog watches come during twilight after the day's work is done, and before the night watch is set, they are the watches in which everybody is on deck. The captain is up, walking on the weather side of the quarter deck, the chief mate on the lee side, and the second mate about the weather gangway. The steward has finished his work in the cabin, and has come up to smoke his pipe with the cook in the galley. The crew are sitting on the windlass or lying on the forecastle, smoking, singing, or telling long yarns. At 8 o'clock, 8 bells are struck, the log is hove, the watch is set, the wheel relieved, the galley shut up, and the other watch goes below. The morning commences with the watch on decks turning to at daybreak and washing down, scrubbing and swabbing the decks. This, together with filling the scuttled butt with fresh water and coiling up the rigging, usually occupies the time until 7 bells, half after 7, when all hands get breakfast. At 8, the day's work begins and lasts until sundown, with the exception of an hour for dinner. Before I end my explanations, it may be well to define a day's work and to correct a mistake prevalent among landsmen about a sailor's life. Nothing is more common than to hear people say, "Are not sailors very idle at sea? What can they find to do?" This is a very natural mistake, and being very frequently made, it is one which every sailor feels interested in having corrected. In the first place, then, the discipline of the ship requires every man to be at work upon something when he is on deck, except at night and on Sundays. Except at these times, you will never see a man on board a well-ordered vessel standing idle on deck, sitting down, or leaning over the side. It is the officer's duty to keep everyone at work, even if there is nothing to be done but to scrape the rust from the chain cables. In no state prison are the convicts more regularly set to work and more closely watched. No conversation is allowed among the crew at their duty, and though they frequently do talk when aloft or when near one another, yet they always stop when an officer is nigh. With regard to the work upon which the men are put, it is a matter which probably would not be understood by one who has not been at sea. When I first left port and found that we were kept regularly employed for a week or two, I supposed that we were getting the vessel into sea trim, and that it would soon be over, and we should have nothing to do but to sail the ship, but I found that it continued so for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, there was as much to be done as ever. As has often been said, a ship is like a lady's watch, always out of repair. When first leaving port, studding sail gear is to be rove, all the running rigging to be examined, that which is unfit for use to be got down, and new rigging rove in its place. Then the standing rigging is to be overhauled, replaced, and repaired in 1,000 different ways, and wherever any of the numberless ropes or the yards are chafing or wearing upon it, their chafing gear, as it is called, must be put on. This chafing gear consists of worming, parceling, rounding, battens, and service of all kinds, both rope yarn, spun yarn, marline, and seizing stuffs. Taking off, putting on, and mending the chafing gear alone upon a vessel would find constant employment for 2 or 3 men during working hours for a whole voyage. The next point to be considered is that all the small stuffs which are used on board a ship, such as spun yarn, marline, seizing stuff, etc., etc., are made on board. The owners of a vessel buy up incredible quantities of old junk, which the sailors unlay after drawing out the yarns, knot them together, and roll them up in balls. These rope yarns are constantly used for various purposes, but the greater part is manufactured into spun yarn. For this purpose, every vessel is furnished with a spun yarn winch, which is very simple, consisting of a wheel and a spindle. This may be heard constantly going on deck in pleasant weather, and we had employment during a great part of the time for 3 hands in drawing and knotting yarns and making spun yarn. Another method of employing the crew is setting up rigging. Whenever any of the standing rigging becomes slack, which is continually happening, the seizings and coverings must be taken off, tackles got up, and after the rigging is bowsed well taut, the seizings and coverings replaced. Let me reread that. Another method of employing the crew is setting up rigging. Whenever any of the standing rigging becomes slack, which is continually happening, the seizings and coverings must be taken off, tackles got up, and after the rigging is boused well taut, the seizings and coverings replaced, which is a very nice piece of work. There's also such a connection between different parts of a vessel that one rope can seldom be touched without altering another. You cannot stay a mast aft by the back stays without slacking up the head stays, etc., etc. If we add to this all the tarring, greasing, oiling, varnishing, painting, scraping, and scrubbing which is required in the course of a long voyage, and also remember this is all to be done in addition to watching at night, steering, reefing, furling, bracing, making and setting sail, and pulling, hauling, and climbing in every direction, one will hardly ask, what can a sailor find to do at sea? If, after all this labor, after exposing their lives and limbs in storms wet and cold, quote, wherein the cub-drawn bear would couch, the lion and the belly-pinched wolf keep their furs dry, end of quote. The merchants and captains think that they have not earned their $12 a month. Let me repeat that. If, after all this labor, after exposing their lives and limbs in storms wet and cold, the merchants and captains think that they have not earned their $12 a month, out of which they clothe themselves, and their salt beef and hard bread, they keep them picking oakum, ad infinitum. This is the usual resource upon a rainy day. For them it will not do to work upon rigging, and when it is pouring down in floods, instead of letting the sailors stand about in sheltered places and talk and keep themselves comfortable, they are separated to different parts of the ship and kept at work picking oakum. I have seen oakum stuff placed about in different parts of the ship, so that the sailors might not be idle in the snatches between the frequent squalls upon crossing the equator. Some officers have been so driven to find work for the crew in a ship ready for sea that they have set them to pounding the anchors, often done, and scraping the chain cables. The, quote, Philadelphia Catechism, end of quote, is, quote, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thou art able, and on the 7th holy stone and decks and scrape the cable, end of quote. This kind of work, of course, is not kept up off Cape Horn, Cape of Good Hope, and in extreme north and south latitudes, but I have seen the decks washed down and scrubbed when the water would have frozen if it had been fresh, and all hands kept at work upon the rigging when we had on our pea jackets and our hands so numb that we could hardly hold our marline spikes. I have here gone out of my narrative course in order that any who may read this may form as correct an idea of a sailor's life and duty as possible. I have done it in this place because for some time our life was nothing but the unvarying repetition of these duties, which can be better described together. Before leaving this description, however, I would state, in order to show landsmen how little they know of the nature of a ship, that a ship carpenter is kept in constant employ during good weather on board vessels which are in what is called perfect sea order. Chapter 4. A rogue, trouble on board, land ho, Pampero, Cape Horn. After speaking the Carolina on the 21st August, nothing occurred to break the monotony of our life until Friday, September 5th, when we saw a sail on our weather starboard beam. She proved to be a brig under English colors, and passing under our stern, reported herself as 49 days from Buenos Aires, bound to Liverpool. Before she had passed us, sail ho was cried again, and we made another sail, for on our weather bow and steering athwart our house. She passed out of hail, but we made her out to be an hermaphrodite brig with Brazilian colors in her main rigging. By her course she must have been bound from Brazil to the south of Europe. probably Portugal. Sunday, September 7th. Fell in with the northeast trade winds. This morning we caught our first dolphin, which I was very eager to see. I was disappointed in the colors of this fish when dying. They were certainly very beautiful, but not equal to what had been said of them. They are too indistinct. To do the fish justice, there's nothing more beautiful than the dolphin when swimming a few feet below the surface on a bright day. It is the most elegantly formed and also the quickest fish in salt water, and the rays of the sun striking upon it and its rapid and changing motions reflected from the water make it look like a stray beam from a rainbow. This day was spent like all pleasant Sabbaths at sea. The decks are washed down, the rigging coiled up, and everything put in order, and throughout the day only one watch is kept on deck at a time. The men are all dressed in their best white duck trousers and redder check shirts, and have nothing to do but to make the necessary changes in the sails. They employ themselves in reading, talking, smoking, and mending their clothes. If the weather is pleasant, they bring their work and their books upon deck, and sit down upon the forecastle and windlass. This is the only day on which these privileges are allowed them. When Monday comes, they put on their terry trousers again, and prepare for 6 days of labor. To enhance the value of the Sabbath to the crew, they are allowed on that day a pudding, or as it is called, a duff. This is nothing more than flour boiled with water and eaten with molasses. It is very heavy, dark, and clammy, yet it is looked upon as a luxury, and really forms an agreeable variety with salt beef and pork. Many a rascally captain has made friends of his crew by allowing them duff twice a week on the passage home. On board some vessels, this is made a day of instruction and of religious exercises, but we had a crew of swearers, from the captain to the smallest boy, and a day of rest and of something like quiet, social enjoyment was all that we could expect. We continued running large before the northeast trade winds for several days until Monday. September 22nd, when upon coming on deck at 7 bells in the morning, we found the other watch aloft. Throwing water upon the sails and looking astern, we saw a small clipper-built brig with a black hull heading directly after us. We went to work immediately and put all the canvas upon the brig which we could get upon her, rigging out our oars for studding sail yards, and continued wetting down the sails by buckets of water whipped up to the masthead, until about 9 o'clock, when there came on a drizzling rain. The vessel continued in pursuit, changing her course as we changed ours to keep before the wind. The captain, who watched her with his glass, said that she was armed and full of men and showed no colors. We continued running dead before the wind, and knowing that we sailed better so, and that clippers are fastest on the wind. We had also another advantage. The wind was light, and we spread more canvas than she did, having royals and sky sails fore and aft, and 10 studding sails, while she, being an hermaphrodite brig, had only a gaff topsail aft. Early in the morning she was overhauling us a little, but after the rain came on and the wind grew lighter, we began to leave her astern. All hands remained on deck throughout the day, and we got our arms in order. But we were too few to have done anything with her, if she had proved to be what we feared. Fortunately, there was no moon, and the night which followed was exceedingly dark, so that by putting out all the lights on board and altering our course 4 points, we hoped to get out of her reach. We had no light in the binnacle, but steered by the stars, and kept perfect silence through the night. At daybreak there was no sign of anything in the horizon, and we kept the vessel off to her course. Wednesday, October 1st. Crossed the equator in long 24° west. I now for the first time felt at liberty, according to the old usage, to call myself a son of Neptune, and was very glad to be able to claim the title without the disagreeable initiation which so many have to go through. After once crossing the line, you can never be subjected to the process, but are considered as a son of Neptune, with full powers to play tricks upon others. This ancient custom is now seldom allowed unless there are passengers on board, in which case there is always a good deal of sport. It had been obvious to all hands for some time that the second mate, whose name was F, was an idle, careless fellow and not much of a sailor, and that the captain was exceedingly dissatisfied with him. The power of the captain in these cases was well known, and we all anticipated a difficulty. F, called Mr. by virtue of his office, was but half a sailor, having always been short voyages and remained at home a long time between them. His father was a man of some property and intended to have given his son a liberal education. But he, being idle and worthless, was sent off to sea and succeeded no better there. For, unlike many scamps, he had none of the qualities of a sailor. He was, quote, not of the stuff that they make sailors of, end of quote. He was one of that class of officers who are disliked by their captain and despised by the crew. He used to hold long yarns with the crew and talk about the captain and play with the boys and relax discipline in every way. This kind of conduct always makes the captain suspicious and is never pleasant in the end to the men, they preferring to have an officer active, vigilant, and distant as may be, with kindness. Among other bad practices, he frequently slept on his watch, and having been discovered asleep by the captain, he was told that he would be turned off duty if he did it again. To prevent it in every way possible, the hen coops were ordered to be knocked up, for the captain never sat down on deck himself and never permitted an officer to do so. The second night after crossing the equator, we had the watch from 8 till 12, and it was my helm for the last 2 hours. There had been light squalls throughout the night, and the captain told Mr. F., who commanded our watch, to keep a bright lookout. Soon after I came to the helm, I found that he was quite drowsy, and at last he stretched himself on the companion and went fast asleep. Soon afterwards, the captain came very quietly on deck and stood by me for some time looking at the compass. The officer at length became aware of the captain's presence, but pretending not to know it, began humming and whistling to himself, to show that he was not asleep, and went forward without looking behind him and ordered the main royal to be loosed. On turning round to come aft, he pretended surprise at seeing the master on deck. This would not do. The captain was too wide awake for him, and beginning upon him at once, gave him a grand blow-up in true nautical style. Quote, "You're a lazy, good-for-nothing rascal. You're neither man, boy, soger, nor sailor. You're no more than a thing aboard a vessel. You don't earn your salt. You're worse than a Mahon soger," and other still more choice extracts from the sailor's vocabulary. After the poor fellow had taken this harangue, he was sent into his stateroom, and the captain stood the rest of the watch himself. At 7 bells in the morning, all hands were called aft and told that F was no longer an officer on board and that we might choose one of our own number for second mate. It is usual for the captain to make this offer, and it is very good policy, for the crew think themselves the choosers and are flattered by it, but have to obey nevertheless. Our crew, as is usual, refused to take the responsibility of choosing a man of whom we would never be able to complain, and left it to the captain. He picked out an active and intelligent young sailor born near the Kennebec, who had been several Canton voyages, and proclaimed him in the following manner: "I choose Jim Hall. He's your second mate. All you've got to do is to obey him as you would me, and remember that he is Mr. Hall." F went forward into the forecastle as a common sailor and lost the handle of his name, while young foremast Jim became Mr. Hall and took up his quarters in the land of knives and forks and teacups. Sunday, October 5th. It was our morning watch when, soon after the day began to break, a man on the forecastle called out, "Land ho!" I had never heard the cry before and did not know what it meant, and few would suspect what the words were when hearing the strange sound for the first time. But I soon found, by the direction of all eyes, that there was land stretching along our weather beam. We immediately took in studding sails and hauled our wind, running in for the land. This was done to determine our longitude, for by the captain's chronometer we were in 25° west, but by his observations we were much farther, and he had been for some time in doubt whether it was his chronometer or his sextant which was out of order. This landfall settled the matter, and the former instrument was condemned, and, becoming still worse, was never afterwards used. As we ran in towards the coast, we found that we were directly off the port of Pernambuco, and could see with the telescope the roofs of the houses in one large church and the town of Olinda. We ran along by the mouth of the harbor and saw a full-rigged brig going in. At 2 p.m. we again kept off before the wind, leaving the land on our quarter, and at sundown it was out of sight. It was here that I first saw one of those singular things called catamarans. They are composed of logs lashed together upon the water, have one large sail, are quite fast, and strange as it may seem, are trusted as good sea boats. We saw several, with from 1 to 3 men in each, boldly putting out to sea after it had become almost dark. The Indians got out in them after fish, and as the weather is regular in certain seasons, they have no fear. After taking a new departure from Olinda, we kept off on our way to Cape Horn. We met with nothing remarkable until we were in the latitude of the river La Plata. Here there are violent gales from the southwest called pamperos, which are very destructive to the shipping in the river and are felt for many leagues at sea. They are usually preceded by lightning. The captain told the mates to keep a bright lookout, and if they saw lightning at the southwest, to take in sail at once. We got the first touch of one during my watch on deck. I was walking in the lee gangway and thought that I saw lightning on the lee bow. I told the second mate, who came over and looked out for some time. It was very black in the southwest, and in about 10 minutes we saw a distinct flash. The wind, which had been southeast, had now left us, and it was dead calm. We sprang aloft immediately and furled the royals and topgallant sails, and took in the flying jib, hauled up the mainsail and trysail, squared the after-yards, and awaited the attack. A huge mist capped with black clouds came driving towards us, extending over that quarter of the horizon and covering the stars which shone brightly in the other part of the heavens. It came upon us at once with a blast and a shower of hail and rain which almost took our breath from us. The hardiest was obliged to turn his back. We let the halyards run, and fortunately were not taken aback. The little vessel paid off from the wind and ran for some time directly before it, tearing through the water with everything flying. Having called all hands, we close reefed the topsails and trysail, furled the courses and jib, set the fore topmast staysail, and brought her up nearly to her course with the weather braces hauled in a little to ease her. This was the first blow that I had seen which could really be called a gale. We had reefed our topsails in the Gulf Stream, and I thought it something serious, but an older sailor would have thought nothing of it. As I had now become used to the vessel and to my duty, I was of some service on a yard, and could knot my reef point as well as anybody. I obeyed the order to lay, this word lay, which is in such general use on board ship, being used in giving orders instead of go, as lay forward, lay aft, lay aloft, etc. I do not understand to be the neuter verb lie, mispronounced, but to be the active verb lay, with the objective case understood as lay yourselves forward, lay yourselves aft, etc. I obeyed the order to lay aloft with the rest and found the reefing a very exciting scene, for one watch reefed the fore topsail and the other the main, and everyone did his utmost to get his topsail hoisted first. We had a great advantage over the larboard watch, because the chief mate never goes aloft, while our new second mate used to jump into the rigging as soon as we began to haul out the reef tackle and have the weather earing past before there was a man upon the yard. In this way we were almost always able to raise the cry of haul out to leeward before them, and having knotted our points would slide down the shrouds and backstays, and sing out at the topsail halyards to let it be known that we were ahead of them. Reefing is the most exciting part of a sailor's duty. All hands are engaged upon it, and after the halyards are let go, there is no time to be lost, no sobering or hanging back then. If one is not quick enough, another runs over him. The first on the yard goes to the weather earing, the second to the lee, and the next two to the dog's ears, while the others lay along into the bunt, just giving each other elbow room. In reefing, the yard arms, the extremes of the yards, are the posts of honor. But in furling, the strongest and most experienced stand in the slings, or middle of the yard, to make up the bunt. If the second mate is a smart fellow, he will never let anyone take either of these posts from him. But if he is wanting either in seamanship, strength, or activity, some better man will get the bunt and earings from him, which immediately brings him into disrepute. We remained for the rest of the night and throughout the next day under the same close sail, for it continued to blow very fresh. And though we had no more hail, yet there was a soaking rain, and it was quite cold and uncomfortable. The more so because we were not prepared for cold weather, but had on our thin clothes. We were glad to get a watch below and put on our thick clothing, boots, and southwesters. Towards sundown, the gale moderated a little, and it began to clear off in the southwest. We shook our reefs out one by one, and before midnight had top gallant sails upon her. We had now made up our minds for Cape Horn in cold weather and entered upon every necessary preparation. Tuesday, November 4th. At daybreak, saw land upon our larboard quarter. There were 2 islands of different size, but of the same shape, rather high, beginning low at the water's edge and running with a curved ascent to the middle. They were so far off to be as of a deep blue color, and in a few hours we sank them in the northeast. These were the Falkland Islands. We had run between them and the mainland of Patagonia. At sunset, the second mate, who was at the masthead, said that he saw land on the starboard bow. This must have been the island of Staten Land, and we were now in the region of Cape Horn, with a fine breeze from the northward, topmast and top gallant, studding sails set, and every prospect of a speedy and pleasant passage round.